5:30 in the morning, December, Palm Beach, Florida. The sun hasn't broken the horizon yet, but the humidity already sits heavy on the skin. Through the mist rolling off the Atlantic, a Mediterranean fortress emerges from 17 acres of manicured lawn, its 75,000 terracotta roof tiles catching the first weak light. 126 rooms spread across 62,500 square feet, 58 bedrooms, 33 bathrooms. Gold leaf ceilings imported panel by panel from a Venetian palazzo that no longer exists. But walk the perimeter at dawn before the groundskeepers arrive, and you'll notice something the architecture magazines never mention. The salt water is eating the foundation, grain by grain. The woman who built it believed she was creating a monument that would outlast her family, her fortune, her name. She was half right. The structure still stands. Everything else crumbled. Was Mar-a-Lago a gift to America that America didn't want, or a burden we couldn't afford to refuse? The morning of March 3rd, 1924, Marjorie Merriweather Post stood on an empty strip of Florida coastline with an architect named Marion Sims Wyeth, and pointed toward the Atlantic. She was 37 years old, the sole heir to the Postum Cereal Company fortune, a business empire built on grape nuts and breakfast flakes, sold by the millions to working families who couldn't afford bacon. Her father, Charles William Post, had died 14 years earlier in 1914, leaving her an empire worth somewhere north of $250 million in money that actually meant something back then. Now she wanted a winter palace, not a cottage, not a villa, a palace, an American palace. Something that would make the Vanderbilts jealous and every European aristocrat who'd ever sneered at American new money choke on their centuries-old bloodlines. Wyeth asked her what architectural style she preferred. Spanish Revival, which was popular in Florida at the time, Venetian Gothic, which had gravitas, Moorish, which had mystery, Portuguese, which had history. She looked at him like he'd asked a stupid question. All of it, she said, everything at once, every style, every period, every architectural tradition that screamed permanence and power and more money than God. Build me a building that looks like it's been standing for 500 years, even though the concrete hasn't dried yet. Wyeth thought she was joking. Clients always joked before they came to their senses and picked something practical. She wasn't joking. She was never joking when it came to permanence. Her father had killed himself with a shotgun in a Battle Creek sanitarium, probably because his depression finally beat his fortune. Her mother had died young. Her first marriage had ended. Nothing in Marjorie Merriweather Post's life had been permanent except the money. And even that came from selling cereal to people who could barely afford it. She needed to build something that couldn't die, that couldn't leave, that couldn't disappoint. Stone and marble don't commit suicide. Gold leaf doesn't get sick. A 75-foot tower doesn't file for divorce. What came next changed Palm Beach forever, though not in the way anyone expected. Wyeth drew plans for a structure that defied category, defied reason, defied gravity in some cases. 115 rooms in the initial design, though that number would grow like a tumor as Post kept adding things she suddenly needed. A 75-foot tower modeled after the Torre del Oro in Seville, except taller and more expensive. Loggias facing both the Atlantic Ocean and Lake Worth, because why choose one view when you have oceanfront on both sides? A 1,000-wing design borrowed from medieval Spanish monasteries, the kind of place where monks prayed for hours and never saw daylight. Except Post's version would have floor-to-ceiling windows because she wasn't interested in darkness. She was interested in showing people exactly how much light she could afford to let in. Post wanted grandeur, but she also wanted something else, something harder to articulate and more important, complete control over every tile, every door handle, every ceiling beam, every square inch of marble, every pane of glass. She'd spent her entire adult life being controlled by men. Her father, who left her a fortune but expected her to marry well. Her first husband, who gambled away chunks of that fortune before she divorced him. The board members of her father's company who thought women shouldn't make business decisions, even when the woman in question owned the entire company. Mar-a-Lago was going to be different. Mar-a-Lago was going to be hers, in a way nothing else ever had been. She hired craftsmen from southern Spain, men who'd spent their lives hand-firing roof tiles in kilns that had been operating since before Columbus sailed. She purchased entire rooms from European estates about to be demolished by debt or war or family dissolution, the kind of rooms that had witnessed centuries of aristocratic life and were now being sold piecemeal to Americans with more money than ancestry. A dining room ceiling from a palazzo in Venice where doges had made decisions that shaped empires. Marble columns from a villa in Genoa that had belonged to merchant princes who'd funded exploration voyages. Carved stone doorways from a monastery outside Barcelona where monks had transcribed manuscripts while empires rose and fell. She wasn't building a house, she was assembling a museum that she could live in, a cathedral to her own permanence where she was both architect and god. The numbers tell you the scale, but they don't tell you the obsession. 75,000 antique Spanish tiles weren't enough, so Post commissioned another 10,000 made by hand, according to 15th century specifications, fired in kilns built specifically for this project, kilns that would be dismantled when the job was done, because they had no other purpose. She imported 50 tons of Dorian stone from Genoa, the specific honey-colored marble that Roman emperors had favored, then decided it wasn't quite right, and ordered another 20 tons as backup, as insurance against her own perfectionism. The tower required steel reinforcement that hadn't been tested in Florida's hurricane climate, metal shipped from Pittsburgh steel mills and installed by engineers who'd worked on skyscrapers in New York. Local contractors warned her, "Hurricanes in Florida don't care how much money you have. The tower could become a liability, a sail catching wind that would tear the roof off the rest of the structure." She built it anyway. The gold leaf for the ceilings came from a Venetian artisan named Giuseppe Moretti, who refused to work with anyone else's specifications, so Post flew him to Florida, housed him in Palm Beach for 18 months, and paid him a salary that exceeded what most American factory workers made in 5 years. When local contractors said certain masonry techniques were impossible in the subtropical heat, when they said mortar wouldn't set properly, when they said Spanish construction methods didn't translate to American climate, she brought in stonemasons from Portugal who'd worked on projects in Brazil and knew exactly how to make European architecture survive in places it was never designed for. The labor pool was a mix of European craftsmen, Caribbean workers, and local Floridians, most of whom were never named in any official record. They worked 6 days a week, 12-hour shifts in summer heat that turned the construction site into an open oven, temperatures that regularly exceeded 100 degrees with humidity that made breathing feel like drowning. OSHA didn't exist yet. Neither did workers' compensation in any meaningful form. If you got hurt, you got fired. If you died, your family got nothing. Maybe a courtesy payment if Post happened to hear about it and felt generous that day. The European craftsmen were treated differently, housed in decent quarters, paid in real money, given respect for their specialized skills. The Caribbean and local workers slept in barracks that had no air conditioning, no running water, no amenities of any kind. They were paid in scrip sometimes. Company money that could only be spent at company stores that charged inflated prices. Post never saw them. That was by design. The wealthy don't want to see the machinery that produces their comfort. By the time the main structure was complete in 1927, Post had spent $7 million. In 1927, money, adjusted for inflation and purchasing power, that's somewhere close to 120 million today. But even that number doesn't capture it, because it's not just about inflation. $7 million in 1927 was enough to build 1,700 modest American homes, 3-bedroom houses with yards and indoor plumbing that working families could actually afford. It was enough to fund a small liberal arts college for a decade, endow professorships, build libraries, educate thousands of young people who couldn't otherwise afford higher education. It was enough to purchase a functioning railroad, dozens of locomotives, and miles of track. Post spent it on a winter retreat she'd occupy 3 months a year, a vacation home, a place to escape the cold while most of America couldn't afford heat. But even then, she wasn't finished. The mansion was complete, but the grounds were bare. She wanted a garden that would make European aristocrats weep with envy. The landscaping alone required another 2 years and another fortune. Post didn't just want palm trees, though she wanted those too. She wanted a tropical jungle that looked wild but was actually more controlled than any formal European garden. She hired landscape architect Marion Kruger Coffin, one of the few successful women in the field, and gave her the same instructions she'd given Wyeth: make it look like it's been here for centuries, even though we're planting it tomorrow. Coffin imported 12,000 plants and trees from botanical gardens across the Caribbean, from Cuba and Jamaica and Trinidad, from Puerto Rico and the Bahamas and the Virgin Islands. Rare palms that had never been grown commercially. Flowering trees that needed specific soil conditions and constant care. Orchids that cost more per plant than most Americans made in a month. Some died within months, killed by salt spray or unexpected cold snaps or soil chemistry that wasn't quite right. Post replaced them, again and again. Failure wasn't permanent if you had enough money to try again. The property required a full-time staff of 30 just to maintain the grounds, a team that worked dawn to dusk, trimming hedges into perfect geometric shapes, deadheading flowers the moment they started to wilt, removing any leaf that fell from any tree before a guest might notice that nature dared to intrude on perfection. Another 20 staff for the house itself. Cooks who trained in French restaurants, maids who knew how to clean gold leaf without damaging it, butlers who understood the specific etiquette of service that Post expected, chauffeurs who could drive visiting dignitaries without getting lost or saying the wrong thing, security guards who knew when to be visible and when to disappear. Most lived in quarters behind the main estate, brick buildings with small rooms and shared bathrooms separated by hedges 15 feet tall, so Post would never have to see them unless she chose to. Out of sight, out of mind, invisible. The question no one asked in 1927 was simple: why? Post was already wealthy beyond measure. She had estates in New York, a sprawling compound in the Adirondacks, a hunting lodge in Wyoming, a Manhattan apartment that took up an entire floor. She didn't need Mar-a-Lago. She needed what it represented. Old money in America has always been insecure in ways European aristocracy never had to worry about. The Rothschilds could trace their lineage back centuries. The British peerage had literal titles enshrined in law. American fortunes, even the biggest ones, were new, raw, built on railroads and oil and steel and breakfast cereal sold by the box to people who worked in factories for 12 hours a day. Post's father had started as a traveling salesman hawking patent medicines and motivational pamphlets. By the time he died, he was one of the richest men in America, but he was never accepted by the Vanderbilts or the Astors or the families who considered themselves real American royalty, the ones whose great-grandfathers had made their money in shipping or land speculation during the colonial era. Marjorie inherited the money, but not the pedigree. Mar-a-Lago was her answer. If she couldn't buy lineage, she'd buy history itself, Room by room, tile by tile, she'd purchase the bones of European nobility and reassemble them on a Florida beach, creating an instant aristocratic past that never actually existed. It was historical cosplay on a scale that only unlimited wealth makes possible. But here's what the architecture magazines never mentioned, what the society pages glossed over, what Post's friends were too polite to say out loud. The place was a nightmare to maintain from the very beginning. Even in 1927, before the first winter season ended, before the first round of impressive dinner parties was over, problems emerged like cracks in the facade. The gold leaf ceilings, Moretti's masterwork, began to tarnish within months. Humidity in Florida isn't like humidity in Venice. The palazzo those ceilings came from had stood for 400 years in a temperate Mediterranean climate. In Florida, moisture came from everywhere, from the ocean spray and the afternoon thunderstorms, and the simple fact that the air was so saturated with water that metal corroded and paper grew mold, and delicate things deteriorated twice as fast as they would anywhere else. The imported marble started cracking along invisible fault lines, stress fractures that appeared seemingly overnight because Italian stone wasn't designed for the temperature swings of South Florida, where it could be 80 degrees at noon and 60 degrees by midnight during winter months. The roof tiles, despite being historically accurate reproductions of 15th century Spanish architecture, leaked during the first major storm because medieval construction techniques didn't include modern waterproofing, and Post had insisted on historical accuracy over practical function. The air conditioning system, which was state-of-the-art for its time, cutting-edge technology that cost a fortune to install, could barely handle the square footage it was supposed to cool. The engineers had designed it for a normal mansion. Mar-a-Lago wasn't normal. Bills started arriving before Post even hosted her first dinner party. 30 staff members on permanent payroll at the Florida estate alone, another 50 at her other properties, salaries that added up to tens of thousands per month in an era when the average American worker made $1,500 a year. Utility costs that exceeded what most American families earned in a year, electric bills and water bills and gas bills that kept climbing because you can't just turn off the air conditioning in an empty mansion or everything inside starts to rot. Insurance premiums that assumed you were insuring a museum, not a home, because that's essentially what it was, a private museum filled with artifacts worth millions that needed protection from fire and theft and hurricanes and the endless list of catastrophes that insurance companies love to enumerate. And repairs, constant repairs, always something, saltwater corrosion on the exterior stonework that had to be sandblasted and resealed every few years. Termites in the wooden ceiling beams, because Florida has termites that eat wood faster than any treatment can stop them for long. Mold in the walls, persistent black mold that grew in the cavities between the imported European stones and the modern American studs, a slow rot that no amount of cleaning could permanently eliminate because you can't seal 75,000 antique tiles against subtropical moisture. The maintenance costs in that first year alone exceeded $50,000, the equivalent of buying a nice house outright in most American cities, and that was just keeping the place from falling apart. It didn't include improvements or upgrades or any of the constant modifications Post wanted as she lived in the space, and realized that her initial vision was incomplete. Post didn't care. Or more accurately, she didn't have to care. Her fortune generated more income in a month than Mar-a-Lago cost in a year. Passive income from the cereal empire that kept churning out grape nuts and Post Toasties and a dozen other breakfast products that Americans bought by the millions, without knowing they were funding someone's palace. She threw parties, elaborate multi-day affairs with orchestras flown in from New York and Boston, full symphonies that performed in the ballroom while guests danced on marble imported from Rome. Caviar imported from Russia by the barrel, sturgeon eggs that cost more per pound than most Americans made in a week, champagne that arrived by the crate from France, cases and cases of Dom Pérignon and Moet that were consumed in single evenings and forgotten by the next morning. She invited senators who made laws that affected millions, ambassadors from countries that most Americans couldn't find on a map, film stars from Hollywood who were just beginning to rival old money in terms of cultural influence, industrialists who controlled steel production and oil refining and every other engine of American economic power. She wanted Mar-a-Lago to be the American equivalent of a European palace, a place where power and wealth gathered not just to socialize, but to see and be seen, where deals were made over dinner and alliances were forged over cigars and whiskey, where the machinery of American empire hummed quietly beneath the surface of polite conversation. For a while it worked. Through the late 20s and into the early 30s, Mar-a-Lago became the crown jewel of Palm Beach society. An invitation wasn't just prestigious, it was a statement of arrival. If Marjorie Merriweather Post invited you to Mar-a-Lago, you'd made it. You were someone who mattered. Then the money started to matter. Not Post's money, specifically. Her fortune was insulated from the stock market crash by the simple fact that people always need to eat breakfast, and Postum products kept selling even when everything else collapsed. America's money. The average person's money. On October 29, 1929, the stock market crashed, and within months the entire economy was in free fall. Banks failed, factories closed, unemployment hit 25%, which meant 1 out of every 4 Americans who wanted to work couldn't find a job. Bread lines formed in every major city. Shanty towns called Hoovervilles sprang up in public parks, where people who'd lost their homes lived in cardboard shacks. Children went to bed hungry. Old people froze to death because they couldn't afford coal for heat. And in Palm Beach, Marjorie Merriweather Post kept hosting parties in a mansion with gold leaf ceilings and 50 full-time servants. The contrast was impossible to ignore, even for Palm Beach society, even for people whose wealth had also survived the crash. Newspapers started running stories, not celebratory profiles anymore, but pointed questions that carried an edge of moral judgment. How much did the last party cost? How many servants does one woman need? Could that money have fed 1,000 families for a year? The criticism didn't stop Post, but it changed the meaning of Mar-a-Lago. What had been a symbol of American success became a symbol of American excess. The same excess that was starving the country. Post married 4 times over her life, each marriage bringing its own complications to Mar-a-Lago, each husband using the estate for his own purposes in ways Post couldn't fully control. Edward F. Hutton, her second husband, was a stockbroker and investor who saw Mar-a-Lago as a backdrop for business deals. He brought clients there, used the prestige of the location to close investments, turned Post's palace into his office. The marriage lasted 13 years and produced 1 daughter before ending in divorce in 1935. Joseph E. Davies, her third husband, was a lawyer and diplomat who'd later serve as ambassador to the Soviet Union. He turned Mar-a-Lago into an extension of Washington power circles, hosting political dinners where decisions about American foreign policy were discussed over Post's imported champagne. That marriage lasted 20 years until 1955, and by the end, Davies was openly having affairs that Palm Beach society whispered about but never mentioned directly to Post's face. By the time she married Herbert A. May, her 4th and final husband in 1958, Post was 71 years old. May was younger, only in his 50s, and no one believed the marriage was about love. It was about companionship and convenience, and having someone to escort her to parties where being alone would have been seen as failure. The estate had become less a home and more a stage, a performance of wealth that required constant maintenance, not just of the physical structure, but of the social fiction that places like this still mattered in post-war America. They didn't. Not in the same way. Not anymore. The generation that built Mar-a-Lago was dying off, their children scattered across the country with their own lives and no interest in maintaining their parents' monuments. The ones who wanted to stay wealthy in the 20th century were selling off the estates, donating them to universities or local governments, converting them into hotels or museums or office buildings, anything that would get the burden of maintenance off the family books. Post's own children had their own homes, their own fortunes by marriage or inheritance subdivision. None of them wanted Mar-a-Lago when Post was gone. They'd already told her so, as politely as rich people can tell their mother that her life's work is actually an expensive mistake they don't want to inherit. The property had become what real estate people called a white elephant, a phrase borrowed from ancient Siam where owning a sacred white elephant was technically an honor but practically a curse because you had to maintain the animal at ruinous expense and couldn't put it to work like a normal elephant. Mar-a-Lago was Post's white elephant, beautiful and sacred and utterly impractical for anyone except her. By the 1960s, Post was in her 70s and beginning to confront mortality in ways she'd avoided for decades. Still hosting, still entertaining, still performing the role of Palm Beach matriarch. But the costs were becoming unsustainable even for her, even with a fortune that generated millions in passive income. The staff had grown to over 50 full-time employees at Mar-a-Lago alone, because as the original servants aged out, or quit, or died, they needed to be replaced. And turnover meant training and inefficiency and the constant friction of teaching new people how Post wanted things done. The annual operating budget exceeded $300,000, which adjusted to today's money is somewhere close to $4 million. And that's just operations, just keeping the lights on and the staff paid and the grounds maintained. Not counting repairs, not counting upgrades, not counting the endless cycle of replacing things that salt air and humidity destroyed faster than money could fix them. The roof tiles needed replacing every 15 years because the salt water ate the terracotta from the inside out. The marble needed resealing every 5 years or it started to crack. The gold leaf needed re-gilding every decade because the tarnish eventually became impossible to clean. The air conditioning system needed complete replacement every 20 years as technology improved and old equipment became obsolete. The plumbing corroded and had to be replaced with modern copper and later with PVC. The electrical system, installed in the 1920s, was a fire hazard by 1960s standards and needed complete rewiring. Every single major system in the house was on a clock, counting down to expensive failure, and Post knew it. She'd always imagined Mar-a-Lago would outlast her, that it would become something permanent, something meaningful beyond one woman's winter retreat. She'd built it to last centuries. She'd purchased the best materials, hired the best craftsmen, spared no expense, but she'd never solved the fundamental problem: who would pay for it after she was gone? Her fortune would be divided among her children and various trusts and charitable foundations. The cereal company would continue operating, but the profits wouldn't flow to Mar-a-Lago anymore. The estate would need its own source of income or its own endowment, millions set aside just to pay the bills in perpetuity. Post didn't have that kind of liquid wealth. Most of her fortune was tied up in stocks and real estate and art collections. She was rich on paper, but cash poor in the way that old money families often are, wealthy in assets they can't easily convert to the money needed to pay for maintenance on those assets. It was a trap, and she knew it. So in 1973, at 86 years old, after decades of searching for an answer, Marjorie Merriweather Post did something extraordinary. She tried to give Mar-a-Lago to the United States government, not sell it, give it, completely free. No strings attached beyond her vision of how it should be used. She offered the estate, the grounds, all the furnishings, everything, with the suggestion that it should become a retreat for presidents and foreign dignitaries, a winter White House, where the business of the nation could be conducted in surroundings worthy of American power. She wrote a formal letter to the National Park Service and the State Department outlining her vision. She genuinely believed this. She genuinely thought the government would say yes, would recognize the extraordinary opportunity she was offering, would jump at the chance to acquire a historic estate worth tens of millions for absolutely nothing. She was offering the American people a gift that would last forever. The government said no, not politely, not with gratitude for the gesture, not with regret that circumstances prevented them from accepting such a generous offer. They just declined. The official reason was maintenance costs. The National Park Service calculated that maintaining Mar-a-Lago as a presidential retreat would cost at least $500,000 per year in 1973 money, closer to $3 million today, and that estimate didn't include security upgrades or modernization or any of the additional infrastructure needed to make the property functional as a working government facility. The State Department was even less interested. They already had Camp David. They didn't need another presidential retreat, especially not one that was so conspicuously opulent that every photograph taken there would feed into criticism about government waste. The real reason was more complicated and more damning. Think about what the government saw when they looked at Mar-a-Lago in 1973. A 75-room mansion requiring 50 full-time staff at minimum. An annual operating budget that would come directly from taxpayer money and show up in the federal budget as a line item that opposition politicians would use as ammunition forever. Security concerns that would be exponentially more complex than any existing presidential retreat, because Mar-a-Lago was on an island accessible by multiple causeways and surrounded by wealthy neighbors who would resist any attempt to create exclusion zones. Environmental concerns, because the property was on a barrier island in a hurricane zone, and any president staying there during storm season would need extensive protection and evacuation plans. And for what? Palm Beach already had a reputation as a playground for the ultra-wealthy, a place where millionaires and billionaires lived in gated compounds and complained about taxes while their servants cleaned their pools. Turning Mar-a-Lago into a winter White House would send exactly the wrong message in a country still reeling from Vietnam, from Watergate, from economic stagnation and urban decay, and all the mounting evidence that the American dream wasn't working for most Americans anymore. The optics were toxic, so they declined, politely, officially, finally. Post was devastated. She'd spent 50 years believing Mar-a-Lago would become her lasting legacy to America. Instead, America looked at her gift and said, "No, thank you. We can't afford it and we don't want it." Post died on September 12, 1973, 6 months after the government rejected her offer. She was 86 years old. The cause of death was listed as natural, though people who knew her said she'd lost the will to live after Mar-a-Lago was rejected. She left the estate to her daughters with instructions to keep trying to donate it to the nation, to find some way to make her vision real even after she was gone. They tried. They failed. The government's position hadn't changed. If anything, it had hardened. As the 1970s progressed and inflation climbed and the economy stagnated and government budgets came under increasing scrutiny, the idea of the federal government accepting a white elephant estate in Palm Beach became more politically impossible with each passing year. The daughters were stuck with a property they didn't want, couldn't afford to maintain, and couldn't give away. Mar-a-Lago sat empty for stretches. Occasional private events, when someone rented the space for a wedding or corporate function, tours for historical societies interested in the architecture. But mostly, it gathered dust. The furniture covered with sheets, the grounds maintained by a skeleton crew that came twice a week to keep the jungle from reclaiming the formal gardens. The maintenance costs didn't stop just because the house was empty. The utilities still ran because you can't turn them completely off without risking catastrophic mold and pest damage. The insurance still needed to be paid because the property was worth too much to leave unprotected. The security still needed to patrol because empty mansions attract vandals and thieves. And every year it sat empty was another year of salt water eating the foundation, another year of humidity warping the woodwork, another year of decline that made the ultimate restoration even more expensive. Then in 1980, the family decided to split the property. They would donate the house and some surrounding land to the National Park Service, but keep the oceanfront parcels for private development, parcels that could be sold to recoup some of the fortune that maintaining Mar-a-Lago had consumed over the decades. It was a compromise, an admission that Post's vision couldn't be realized intact, but maybe pieces of it could survive. The government would get Mar-a-Lago as a museum or historical site, but wouldn't have to maintain 17 acres of prime beach real estate or deal with the complications of owning property adjacent to some of the wealthiest people in America. The Park Service considered it seriously this time, studied it, sent appraisers and architects and engineers to evaluate the structure and estimate costs, and then declined again. Same reason, maintenance costs. But this time, there was an additional concern that was harder to articulate in official documents. What would they actually do with it? It wasn't historically significant enough to justify the expense of running it as a museum. Presidents had never stayed there. No major treaties had been signed in the ballroom. No critical moments of American history had unfolded in those rooms. It was just a very expensive house that someone very wealthy had built because they could. That's not a good enough reason for the federal government to spend taxpayer money keeping the roof from leaking and the toilets from backing up. By 1985, the Post family was desperate. 12 years of carrying costs had bled millions. Property taxes alone ran into 6 figures annually, calculated on an assessed value in the tens of millions, even though the property was unsellable at anything close to that price. The grounds required constant maintenance, a team that trimmed hedges and replaced dead plants and fought the endless battle against nature, trying to reclaim manicured perfection. The structure needed emergency repairs, not just cosmetic updates, but serious structural work on the roof and the foundation and the electrical system. The longer the house sat empty, the worse these problems became, and the more it would cost to restore it to a condition where someone might actually want to buy it. They needed to sell, but who buys a house that even the government won't take for free? The real estate market for 75-room estates with 50-person staff requirements is not exactly robust. There were maybe a dozen people in America who could afford a property like Mar-a-Lago, and most of them already had estates. The ones who didn't weren't interested in taking on a white elephant that would consume their fortunes just to maintain. The family listed it anyway, dropped the price, dropped it again. The property that had cost $7 million to build in 1927, worth perhaps $100 million if you factored in the land value and historical significance and all the imported furnishings, was now being shopped for whatever someone would pay. Fire sale, going out of business prices. Please someone take this thing off our hands before it bankrupts what's left of the family fortune. That someone turned out to be a New York real estate developer who'd made his name building casinos in Atlantic City. A man who understood spectacle and luxury and how to market exclusivity to people with more money than taste. He paid $10 million in December 1985. $10 million for 17 acres of oceanfront Palm Beach property, prime real estate that should have been worth $10 million just for the land. plus a 75-room mansion with gold leaf ceilings and imported marble and architectural details that couldn't be replicated for any price because the craftsmen who'd created them were long dead, plus furnishings worth millions on their own. Antiques that Post had collected over decades, 10 million total. It was a theft, a fire sale, an insult to Post's legacy and proof that legacy means nothing if someone still has to pay the electric bill. The Post family accepted because they had no choice. Another year of carrying costs would have eaten whatever money the sale generated. They were selling to stop the bleeding, not to honor their grandmother's vision. The new owner had zero interest in preserving Mar-a-Lago as it was. He saw potential, not historical potential, not cultural potential, financial potential. The property was worth far more as a club than as a private residence. Palm Beach was full of wealthy people who wanted access to exclusive spaces, who wanted to rub shoulders with other wealthy people, who wanted to be able to tell their friends they belonged to the most exclusive club in South Florida. Membership clubs charged initiation fees, annual dues, event fees. You could turn Mar-a-Lago into a profit center if you marketed it correctly, if you made the exclusivity the selling point instead of the architecture. So he divided the estate. Created a private club in the main house, with membership limited to whoever could afford the entrance fee. Converted 25 bedrooms into a luxury hotel because club members who lived elsewhere would need somewhere to stay when they visited. Built cabanas along the beach for additional revenue, luxury changing rooms, and private spaces that could be rented by the day. Installed dining facilities that operated like high-end restaurants. Event spaces that could be rented for weddings and galas and corporate functions. A spa with massage rooms and treatment areas. Modernized the kitchens with industrial equipment. Added parking that destroyed some of Post's original landscaping but was necessary for a functioning business. He kept some of Post's original furnishings for authenticity, the pieces that would photograph well and create the impression of historical continuity. But the rest was gutted and modernized. The plumbing was replaced, the electrical system was upgraded, the HVAC was completely redone with modern systems that actually worked. Mar-a-Lago wasn't a palace anymore, it was a business. And businesses need to make money, not sit empty honoring dead heiresses who thought their vision mattered more than profit margins. The numbers started working once the property was reframed as a business instead of a white elephant. Initiation fees were set at $100,000 per member when the club opened in 1995, a sum that was simultaneously obscene and accessible to Palm Beach's wealthy population. $100,000 bought you access to the club's facilities, the right to make reservations at the dining room, the ability to bring guests and host events, and most importantly, the social capital of being able to say you were a member of Mar-a-Lago. The fee was raised to $200,000 within a few years as demand increased, and the owner realized he could charge more because exclusivity itself has value independent of the actual amenities provided. Annual dues started at $25,000, covering your right to continue being a member and accessing the facilities you'd already paid 6 figures to access in the first place. Want to host an event? That's extra. Rates starting at $50,000 for a basic wedding reception and climbing from there depending on guest count and menu and how many staff members you needed and what parts of the property you wanted to reserve. Want to stay in one of the hotel rooms? That's extra, rates comparable to 5-star hotels, even though you were already paying dues for the privilege of being allowed to pay more. Everything had a price, every amenity was monetized, and wealthy members paid it because exclusivity itself has value in circles where everyone already has more money than they can spend. By the 2000s, Mar-a-Lago was profitable, not just surviving. Thriving, not just covering its costs, generating actual profit. The club had 500 members at any given time, turning over slowly as people died or moved or had their memberships revoked for various infractions. 500 members at 200,000 each was 100 million in initiation fees alone, revenue that came with no corresponding obligation except maintaining the facility they were paying to access. Annual dues from 500 members at 25,000 each generated 12.5 million per year in recurring revenue. Events generated millions more. Hotel rooms generated hundreds of thousands. The spa and other amenities added additional revenue streams. The total was enough to cover the maintenance costs that had scared off the government, enough to pay the staff, enough to fund the endless repairs, enough to generate actual profit for the owner. The maintenance costs that had made Mar-a-Lago a white elephant suddenly became manageable when distributed across hundreds of wealthy individuals, instead of falling on one person or one government agency. Annual operating costs in the 2000s ran somewhere between 5 and 8 million, depending on how much repair work was needed in any given year. Staff payroll for 100 full-time employees cost roughly 4 million annually, more than the Post family had paid, but with more staff to handle the increased demands of running a club. Utilities for a property that size in South Florida cost $1.5 million. Electric bills that would make normal homeowners weep, but were just a line item in a multi-million-dollar budget. Grounds maintenance cost around $1 million per year. A dedicated team that worked full-time, replacing plants killed by storms and fighting the eternal battle against saltwater and invasive species. Insurance cost $2 million annually for a property that valuable in a hurricane zone, and that was assuming no major claims. Repairs were ongoing and unpredictable, but averaged at least $1 million per year for routine structural issues. Roof maintenance that needed to happen every year, air conditioning repairs, plumbing problems, and the endless fight against moisture damage that no amount of money could permanently solve. The numbers were brutal. But when you have 20 million coming in, 15 million going out, you end up with 5 million in profit, and that's sustainable. That's a business model. That's the difference between a white elephant and a cash cow. But here's what didn't change, what couldn't change no matter how the ownership structure evolved. The people who actually made Mar-a-Lago function were still invisible, still exploited, still working in conditions that would shock the members who paid $500,000 for access. The cooks, the cleaners, the groundskeepers, the maintenance workers, the valets, the servers, the housekeepers. Most were immigrants, many from Latin America, Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador. Some from Eastern Europe, Poland and Romania and Ukraine. Some from the Caribbean, Jamaica and Haiti and the Dominican Republic. They worked the same long hours their predecessors worked in the 1920s, though now they had labor protections on paper, even if those protections weren't always enforced in practice. Reports would later emerge about undocumented workers on the staff, people whose immigration status was questionable at best and whose vulnerability made them ideal employees because they couldn't complain or demand better conditions without risking deportation. About wages that barely cleared minimum wage requirements, $10 or $12 an hour for people working in one of the wealthiest zip codes in America. About working conditions that mirrored the exploitation of Post's original construction crews, just dressed up in 21st century corporate language about efficiency and cost management. The people who paid $500,000 for membership never saw these workers unless something went wrong. That was by design. That was part of the luxury, invisibility, service without the burden of acknowledging the servers. Mar-a-Lago's transformation into a private club also transformed its meaning in ways the owner probably didn't fully anticipate or care about. Post had built it as a personal monument, then tried to make it a national one, failed at both. As a club, it became something else entirely, a symbol of access, of who got in and who didn't, of the invisible barriers that separate the wealthy from everyone else. Membership was theoretically open to anyone who could pay, but money alone didn't guarantee entry. You needed connections, references, someone already inside vouching for you. The right last name, or the right business connections, or the right political alignment, or the right mix of wealth and power and social capital that defined Palm Beach society. The club's membership list became a who's who of wealthy conservatives, Republican donors, corporate executives, celebrities who leaned right, and people who wanted proximity to power. It was networking disguised as leisure. Every dinner party, every golf outing, every conversation in the hallways was potentially worth millions in business deals or political favors or social connections that opened doors that money alone couldn't. That's what people were really paying for. Not the gold leaf ceilings or the imported marble or the beach access. The access to other people who had what they wanted: more money, more power, more influence, more of everything that made life easy for the people at the top. Then came the complications money can't fix. In the 2000s and 2010s, Mar-a-Lago became more than a club. It became a stage for political theatre, a backdrop for controversies that had nothing to do with Marjorie Merriweather Post's original vision. Security concerns multiplied. The property was designed as a private residence, not a secure facility. Too many access points, too many windows. The perimeter was porous, surrounded by water on multiple sides. During certain periods, Secret Service presence became permanent, requiring modifications that cost millions and disrupted normal operations. Security checkpoints, surveillance systems, restricted areas. The club's dual purpose created tensions no one knew how to resolve. Members who joined for exclusivity found themselves sharing space with news cameras outside the gates, protesters, and public scrutiny that no amount of money could eliminate. The privacy that defined old money estates was gone. The place became a symbol, and symbols don't get privacy. Every event became news. Every membership decision became political. The club found itself at the center of conversations about access and privilege in ways that threatened the business model, depending on discretion. By the 2020s, Mar-a-Lago existed in a strange liminal space that no one had planned for and no one quite knew how to manage. Still a private club technically, still operating under the same membership model that had made it profitable, but functionally operating under a level of public interest and governmental oversight that no ordinary club would ever face. The property taxes alone ran over $500,000 annually, calculated on an assessed value that kept climbing even as the club's reputation became increasingly controversial. The owner claimed primary residence status to reduce the tax burden, a designation that required proving he actually lived there most of the year, which created its own complications when the property was also a functioning commercial club. The distinction between private home and commercial business became legally murky in ways that benefited the owner but frustrated everyone trying to regulate or understand what Mar-a-Lago actually was. Was it a residence, a club, a political headquarters? All three? The answer mattered for zoning, for taxes, for security protocols, for a dozen different regulatory frameworks that applied differently depending on how you classified the property. Local authorities and federal agencies couldn't agree, and the confusion created a gray area that everyone exploited for their own purposes. Meanwhile, Palm Beach residents who'd tolerated Mar-a-Lago as a quiet club grew tired of the motorcades, security checkpoints, and disruptions. The town sued multiple times: zoning violations, safety violations, noise complaints, parking violations, traffic violations. None of the lawsuits succeeded in fundamentally changing how Mar-a-Lago operated, but they revealed how much the property had become a burden to the community, how something that was supposed to be a private club had metastasized into a public problem. The mathematics of maintaining Mar-a-Lago in the 2020s became even more brutal as the property's dual function created cascading complications. Annual operating costs exceeded $15 million in years with significant security requirements. Staff payroll for 150 employees expanded from the original 100 to handle increased demands and security protocols, cost roughly $6 million annually. Utilities for a property that size in South Florida, with additional power demands from expanded security systems and climate control for areas that were now occupied year-round, ran $1.5 million. Grounds maintenance cost more than $1 million, with a dedicated team that now had to work around security restrictions and deal with additional wear from increased foot traffic. Insurance hit $2 million annually for a property that valuable in a hurricane zone, with additional riders for the political exposure and liability that came with the property's controversial status. Repairs remained ongoing and unpredictable, with at least $1 million per year budgeted for structural issues, roof maintenance, air conditioning failures, plumbing problems, and the eternal fight against moisture damage. But the biggest new cost was security. During periods of high-profile residency, security costs could spike to several million per month when you factored in Secret Service requirements, which the government paid for, plus additional private security that the club needed to hire to supplement federal protection, plus surveillance systems that needed constant upgrading, plus modified access protocols that required more staff and more equipment, and more of everything that keeps unwanted people out and authorized people safe. Then add property taxes, legal fees for the constant zoning battles and regulatory disputes, public relations costs to manage the property's increasingly controversial reputation, insurance for the political and legal exposure that came with being at the center of national controversy, and a dozen other line items that hadn't existed when Mar-a-Lago was just a quiet club. The total operating budget some years exceeded $20 million. The club brought in roughly $20 million annually from membership fees and events when things were running smoothly. That math left very little margin for error. In good years, with no major repairs needed and no extended security requirements and strong membership numbers, you might clear $5 million in profit. In bad years, with a hurricane causing structural damage or membership declining because of political controversy or extended security presence limiting the club's normal operations, you might break even or even lose money. It was sustainable, barely. As long as nothing went seriously wrong and membership stayed strong and members kept paying $500,000 for access despite the ongoing controversies and complications. Something went seriously wrong. In August 2022, federal agents executed a search warrant at Mar-a-Lago, looking for materials that allegedly shouldn't have been at the property. The details are still being argued in courts and will likely remain contentious for years. But the image of federal agents walking through Post's ballroom with boxes of materials, photographs that appeared in every newspaper and on every news website and in every social media feed, turned Mar-a-Lago from a political symbol into something more complicated. The legal implications cascaded in every direction. Membership numbers fluctuated wildly as some people fled the controversy and didn't renew, while others signed up specifically because of it, because being associated with Mar-a-Lago had become a political statement in itself. Events were cancelled or moved by members who didn't want their weddings or corporate functions entangled with ongoing legal battles. The property's reputation, always complicated, became radioactive in ways that affected everything from insurance rates to regulatory scrutiny to the club's ability to operate normally. Some people saw vindication in the search, proof that the property had been used improperly, that the blurred line between private club and public function had led to exactly the kind of problems critics had predicted. Others saw persecution, federal overreach, the government targeting a private citizen and his private property for political reasons. But everyone agreed on one thing. The place that Marjorie Merriweather Post built to last forever had become the center of something she never could have imagined. Not a monument to American success, not a gift to the nation, not even a successful business operating quietly in the background of Palm Beach society. A fortress under siege, surrounded by lawyers and cameras and protesters and supporters, and questions that had nothing to do with architecture or history, and everything to do with power. Who has it? Who uses it? Who abuses it? And what happens when private wealth becomes so entangled with public power that the distinction between them becomes meaningless? The irony cuts deep enough to draw blood. Post spent $7 million creating a legacy, believing that money and beauty and historical importance would make Mar-a-Lago permanent, would make it matter, would make it mean something beyond her own desire for permanence. The government rejected it twice, in 1973 and again in 1980, because they couldn't afford the maintenance and didn't see the value in spending taxpayer money on someone else's monument to wealth. Fair enough. Reasonable even. Then someone bought it for $10 million, less than the land alone was worth, and turned it into a profit center by making exclusivity the product instead of beauty or history. Also fair. Capitalism works. The club became profitable. The mansion was saved from demolition. Post's architecture survived, even if her vision didn't. But then the property became so politically valuable, so culturally significant, so entangled with power, that its existence as a functioning club became almost secondary to its existence as a symbol. And symbols don't need maintenance. Symbols don't leak when it rains. Symbols don't require staff or insurance or endless repairs. Symbols just exist in the public imagination, meaning whatever people need them to mean. But underneath all the controversy, all the political theater, all the legal battles and membership disputes and regulatory fights, Mar-a-Lago is still just a house. A very expensive house built on sand in a hurricane zone, with a roof that still leaks and a foundation the ocean is slowly eating. The gold leaf ceilings still tarnish every few years and need regilding. The marble still cracks from temperature fluctuations because Italian stone wasn't designed for South Florida. The tiles still need replacing every decade or two because salt water corrodes terracotta from the inside out. The air conditioning still breaks constantly because the system was never designed to handle this much square footage in this climate. The plumbing still corrodes and needs replacing. The staff still works 12-hour shifts for wages that barely cover rent in West Palm Beach because they certainly can't afford to live in Palm Beach proper. None of that changes, regardless of who owns it or what it represents. The building doesn't care about legacy. The building doesn't care about politics. The building just cares about survival, about having someone willing to pay the bills and fix the roof and fight the ocean that wants to reclaim the land. Walk Mar-a-Lago today and you'll see layers, archaeological strata of meaning and use and purpose that don't quite align. Post's original vision buried under decades of modifications and additions. The Venetian ceiling in the ballroom, still beautiful, still historically significant, now covered by modern lighting rigs and sound systems installed for events. The Spanish tiles on the roof, 75,000 of them, still holding after 90 years, but patched in places with modern replacements that don't quite match the originals because the craftsmen who made them are long dead and modern manufacturing can't replicate the slight irregularities of hand-fired clay. The grounds, still manicured, still formally planted, but now dotted with security cameras and reinforced fencing and guard stations that would horrify Post if she could see them. The beach access, once private and pristine, now monitored by security and subject to protocols that change depending on who's staying at the property and what their protection requirements are. The staff quarters, still separated from the main house by tall hedges, still designed to keep the workers invisible, now home to people who commute from West Palm Beach or further because they can't afford to live anywhere near the place where they spend most of their waking hours. The dining room where Post entertained senators and ambassadors and industrial titans now hosts weddings for people who pay $50,000 or more for the privilege of getting married in a room once owned by someone famous. The ballroom where orchestras played for guests in formal dress now serves double duty as event space and occasional backdrop for things Post couldn't have imagined. The bedrooms she designed for extended family and important visitors now generate revenue as hotel rooms. The beach where she walked in the mornings now has cabanas for rent. Every layer tells a story, and none of the stories agree about what Mar-a-Lago actually means, or should mean, or ever meant in the first place. The financial burden never disappeared. It just shifted, moving from person to institution to distributed network, but always present, always demanding feeding. From Post's personal fortune, drawn down at rates that would have eventually consumed even her massive wealth if she'd lived longer. To her family's carrying costs, 12 years of bleeding money trying to honor her vision while watching the estate deteriorate. To the government's rejection twice, a clear statement that some gifts are too expensive to accept. To a club membership model that worked by distributing the burden across hundreds of wealthy individuals instead of concentrating it in one place. To a mix of revenue streams, membership fees and event rentals and hotel rooms and everything else that could be monetized. Someone always pays to keep Mar-a-Lago standing. The question is who, and whether what they get in return is worth it, and whether they had any choice in the matter. For Post, it was worth $7 million because she believed she was building something permanent, creating a legacy that would outlast her. For the government, it wasn't worth the maintenance costs because they saw a liability disguised as a gift, a political nightmare wrapped in gold leaf. For the developer who bought it, it was worth $10 million because he saw profit potential that everyone else had missed. For the current members, it's worth $500,000 each because they see access and exclusivity and networking opportunities that might generate returns far exceeding the entrance fee. But for the workers, the ones who clean the rooms and trim the hedges and serve the dinners and maintain the machinery that keeps everything functioning, it's just a job, a paycheck. A place where rich people gather and poor people work, and nobody talks about the gap between them, because talking about that gap would ruin the illusion of effortless luxury that the whole enterprise depends on. Mar-a-Lago's story is uniquely American in the worst possible ways. Extraordinary wealth poured into something beautiful and ultimately unsustainable. A gift refused because the recipient was too practical to accept the burden. A private purchase that turned into public spectacle. Invisible labor propping up visible luxury. Wealth creating monuments while poverty maintains them. A place built to symbolize permanence, becoming the center of impermanence, controversy and chaos that changes by the year. Post wanted a monument. She got a metaphor. A metaphor for what happens when you build a legacy on money alone, when you assume grandeur equals meaning, when you create something so expensive to maintain that the cost becomes the story instead of the structure itself. A metaphor for American class divisions, for the gap between those who pay to enter and those who work to maintain. A metaphor for the impossibility of permanence in a country that destroys and rebuilds and destroys again every generation. The salt water is still eating the foundation, grain by grain, molecule by molecule, patient and relentless. The humidity is still warping the woodwork, expanding and contracting the imported timber, making doors stick and floors creak. The roof still leaks during major storms, despite constant repairs, because you can't make 75,000 antique tiles completely watertight. The staff still works in conditions that would shock visitors who only see the ballroom and the beach. The bills still arrive every month, tens of thousands of dollars, just to keep the lights on and the pipes from bursting and the structure from collapsing under its own ornate weight. And somewhere beneath all the controversy, all the politics, all the legal drama, and public spectacle and membership disputes, Marjorie Merriweather Post's original vision is still there, buried under 90 years of history that she couldn't control and didn't predict and probably wouldn't recognize if she could see it now. She wanted Mar-a-Lago to last forever. It's lasted long enough to prove that forever is expensive, complicated, and rarely turns out the way you planned. The building stands, the legacy collapsed, and somewhere in the gap between those two facts is the truth about American wealth. It builds monuments that outlast memory, monuments to people whose names we forget and purposes we misunderstand. But it can't force anyone to care. It can't make meaning out of marble. It can't turn gold leaf into something more valuable than the fleeting impression of importance it creates. All it can do is pay the bills for another year and another and another, until finally the money runs out, or the ocean wins, or someone decides the cost isn't worth it anymore and walks away, leaving the building to become what it always threatened to become, a ruin that tourists photograph without understanding, asking what it was for and why anyone thought it mattered, and whether all that money could have been spent on something, anything, that would have actually helped someone, instead of just impressing them for a moment before they moved on to the next spectacle. What remains is 17 acres of prime real estate worth hundreds of millions. A structure whose historical significance is now hopelessly entangled with political controversy that will define how it's remembered long after everyone currently fighting over its meaning is dead. And a question that will outlive everyone involved. Was it ever really worth it? The money Post spent believing she was buying immortality, the money her family lost trying to honor her vision, the money the government refused to spend accepting her gift, the money the current owner pumps in to keep it functional, the money members pay for access, the money workers earn by staying invisible. Add it all up across 90 years, and you get a number so large it stops meaning anything. A number that could have built hospitals or schools or housing for thousands of families. A number that instead bought gold leaf ceilings that tarnish in the humidity while the ocean waits patiently to reclaim the sand you built on. If Mar-a-Lago teaches us anything, it's this: someone always pays. The question is never whether the price is worth it. The question is whether the people paying are the same people benefiting, and whether anyone bothers to ask their permission before spending their money, their labor, or their legacy on someone else's monument to themselves. Marjorie Merriweather Post never asked her workers if they wanted to build a palace. The government never asked taxpayers if they wanted to maintain one. The club never asked Palm Beach residents if they wanted the controversy and chaos that came with having a political fortress in their neighborhood. And the people fighting over Mar-a-Lago's future now will never ask the people still cleaning the bathrooms and trimming the hedges what they think about the place their labor keeps standing. Because the truth is, monuments don't care who built them or who maintains them or who suffers to keep them gleaming. They only care that someone does. And America, for better or worse, never runs out of people willing to pay for someone else's dream, as long as that dream looks impressive enough from the outside. The gates are still gold, though they need repainting every few years. The tower still rises 75 feet, though engineers worry about hurricane loads. The ocean still threatens the foundation, patient and inevitable. And somewhere in the archives, there's a letter from Marjorie Merriweather Post to the United States government, offering a gift the nation refused. That letter tells you everything you need to know about Mar-a-Lago. It was always too expensive to love, too beautiful to demolish, too complicated to ignore, too entangled with American class and power and wealth to ever be just a building. It was built to last forever. It will probably stand another 100 years, maintained by workers whose names we'll never know, paid for by members whose fortunes depend on systems those workers will never benefit from, fought over by politicians whose legacies will rise or fall based on their relationship to a house built by a woman who died 50 years ago, still believing that money could buy permanence. But whether anyone will remember why it mattered, or whether it will just become another ruined tourist's photograph without understanding, another data point in the long history of American excess, depends entirely on whether we're willing to ask the question Post never wanted to confront: what is the cost of grandeur, and who ends up paying the bill long after the architect is dead? The fortune is spent, the original dream has been buried under 90 years of someone else's reality, and the only thing left is the structure and the debt and the quiet certainty that someone, somewhere, is still paying for someone else's definition of forever. The answer is standing there, waiting, 17 acres of it, gleaming in the Florida sun, slowly sinking into the sand, while the ocean measures time in erosion that money cannot stop, and power cannot reverse, and dreams cannot survive. That's what remains, not the legacy Post wanted, not the monument she imagined, not the winter White House she offered to a nation that said no thank you, just a building and a bill, and the endless cycle of wealth creating beauty while poverty maintains it. And the question of whether any of it ever mattered beyond the fleeting impression of importance it created in the minds of people wealthy enough to confuse expense with meaning. If you found this story compelling, there are dozens of other American estates with equally complex histories that reveal the hidden costs behind our monuments to wealth. Stories about places like the Biltmore Estate in North Carolina, or Hearst Castle in California, or the Breakers in Newport. Mansions that consumed fortunes and changed hands and became symbols of something their builders never intended. Let me know in the comments which property you'd like explored next, and if you haven't already, consider subscribing. There's more history buried in these walls than most people realize. Stories about the gap between what wealth builds and what wealth destroys. And someone needs to tell those stories before they're completely forgotten beneath the renovations and the controversies and the endless cycle of buying and selling the American dream, one estate at a time, one fortune at a time, one generation's monument becoming the next generation's burden, until